From 27 Elm Street, Upper Saddle River, this is People Who Don't Matter. People Who Don't Matter is sponsored by
Kraft Homestyle Macaroni and Cheese. Cheesy noodles topped with golden brown breadcrumbs. You know you love it.
So today we're going to be discussing the Vietnam draft and how it's remembered, particularly in the Northern Highlands community, compared to how it's remembered by the country as a whole.
We're going to see how their memory compares to the actual past. Vietnam War started in the early 1960s when Americans started having problems with the Northern Vietnamese. The war escalated into the late 60s with the introduction of the military draft.
Around 1.7 people would be drafted.
Million.
1.7 million people would be drafted. As people started going to the war, a large gap grew between the hawks and doves of the country. Generally, when people think back to the main factions during the period, it's between these two groups, anti-war and the pro-war.
Basically hippies versus old jingoists.
Even though it was a lot more than that.
Yeah, but that's basically what it boiled down to.
But, okay, yes. Yeah, so lots of different people started to protest. That's generally where people start to assume they were hippies. Probably the more advertised protesters were the students. Those ones got out more. But the ones like Kent State were really getting big when they were shown on television and talked about. And then obviously with the students, there were also going to be some pro-war students too.
Lots of politicians, veterans, etc. Parts of really all groups of people were pro-war, and there are parts that were anti-war.
So more than 1.5 million people complied and went to fight. Others supported in other ways, but many people held large protests that were usually televised and made a big deal, like the Kent State one. Lots of people actually ended up evading the war too by not going into the draft.
Yeah, about 200,000.
And what happened as the war went on, the support, it jumped around a lot with battles and stuff, but more and more people started to be against it.
People really started getting annoyed with the losses. And actually, when we asked Mr. Amara about how students in Highlands were specifically reacting, he told us a story about a kid who basically is the perfect case to show how people started changing their views on the war.
I don't know what happened in that regard. But in any case, the day after Kent State, I'm about to teach my class, and this one boy, Steve, I won't say his last name, he comes walking into class, and I don't know, I must have brought up what had happened or something. And he said, they deserved it. They deserved it. And I said, what do you mean? Who deserved it? He said, those protesters, meaning these American students, they deserve to get shot. And I said, whoa, wait a second. And I was a pretty liberal person. I came to be very much against the war. But so I was pretty much taken aback by his opinion, but I didn't challenge him really, and I wouldn't have done that. But the really interesting thing was, so he was a senior then. The next year he was at college, and he came back to visit, like at Christmas or Thanksgiving or something. And he comes in, we're talking and all that, and he said, my mother says that if I get drafted, I should just go to Canada. And I said, Steve, this is the exact opposite of what you were saying a year ago, after Kent State. Well, that was in May. I'm pretty sure it was in May of whatever year it was. And, it was like 5 months later. But the whole point was his position, his viewpoint really evolved once it was going to hit home to him. It was a whole different thing than those stupid protesters out there.
So what we need to talk about are how those feelings changed in and out of the community in the later part of the 20th century, once the war had already ended, and up to now.
And it's really hard to sum up the feelings of the entire Highlands community, but we did find some interesting things.
And one of the main places to, voice your opinions was the Fling at the time. There weren't many articles pertaining to Vietnam that we found, but we did manage to find a few. Some were mixed. They gave the pros and cons that occurred due to the war. Opinion-wise, they were pretty split down the middle, but some articles like, quote, don't spurn the refugees, in the late 70s had much clearer stances on how the war affected the country.
The article talked about how, after the war was lost, Americans wanted to get rid of the Vietnamese refugees to quote the beliefs of this kid so that America would, quote, be rid of all signs of that long conflict in which the U.S. lost 56,000 lives.
We got pretty lucky that this article was that clear because many weren't. They were really just factual and apolitical without giving their opinions. This was one of the only articles where it was clear that the author was not a fan of the war and did not think the treatment of the refugees because of the war was good. But one other article that could be about the community's feeling of the war it was this about the election of 1976. And Ford did lose, Carter ended up winning, but in this article it showed how the majority of each grade supported Ford. 56% of seniors, 67% of juniors, 68% of sophomores, and the rest of the population in each grade was split pretty evenly between Carter and McCarthy.
So we tried to look into what Ford had done with this term that students liked. And the main things that pointed out to us that didn't deal with inflation and the economy was that he was really the president when the war ended. He was one of the presidents that signed the Helsinki Accords. And this kind of parallel to how anti-Iraq people supported Obama for withdrawing troops from Iraq.
Ford also ended up granting a lot of amnesty towards draft evaders and deserters.
So since those are the main foreign policy actions he took, it makes sense that people who are anti-war liked him, and that's a possibility why he was so liked by students.
And this may not be concrete evidence that most students supported the war, but when we looked back at even the yearbooks after the draft, the quotes in there really seemed like they had something to do with the draft or the after-feeling effect of having a war. Quotes like,
I take perhaps my last ride on this planet carousel and ask how many more times round I have to catch that brass ring sun before the game is up.
or quote,
The fulfillment of our younger dreams, yet the realization of the complexity of life.
This may be considered overanalyzing a yearbook, but both quotes have to do with sort of an ending in a period of the students' lives before, quote, the game is up, or, quote, the realization of the complexity of life. But this may, and even though this may just be about adulthood, but because they were right after the war, and because of how dark they seem, it's possible they have to do with Vietnam and fighting and the change that happens when you're officially of age for the draft. In that case, they would be another set of examples toward the anti-war feelings during the time.
Another abstract example is this mural we found in the hallway.
Mural.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Alright, in the hallway of Northern Highlands. I'll try my best to describe it for you. On the left there is a red backdrop, and there is a torn up American flag, which is the most prominent image. And under this American flag, there are several soldiers with gas masks on them. There's also a picture of a tank, and the whole color scheme is just red and black. It is very depressing. It is kind of a scary image. But the funniest thing is, on the right side of the picture, it all morphs and blends into this very light-looking blue and white color scheme, where white doves are flying in the air on top of a blue sky.
So we took the mural as a very anti-war image with the red backdrop, the torn American flag, and we know that it was technically made in the early 2000s, so it makes more sense that it'd have to do with the Iraq War. But the first war that happened in Northern Highlands history was the Vietnam War, and since then there's been this kind of anti-war feeling and memories that we've seen from looking at the Fling, the yearbook, and interviewing students. And that anti-war feeling could have been keep on increasing till the Iraq War, and it could be a reason for and contribute to how people felt about the Iraq War in Northern Highlands, especially with the faculty members and adults, and it could have inspired and led to this mural.
We went around to kids in the hallway to find out what current Northern Highlands opinions were on the war. So we asked them what came to mind when they heard words like Vietnam War and the Vietnam Draft.
The most consistent words that we got were, quote, protest, war, bloodshed, failure, and unnecessary came up a lot more.
And when we asked Mr. Emra
The head of the English department,
what his opinions and memories were of the war, many of them had to do with the negative or sad sides to it.
Life magazine. You ever hear of Life magazine? Yeah. It used to be a weekly. It's out of business now, except for specials here and there. But they did something pretty radical. I mean, their issues were always sort of happy stories, great photographs, but they were happy stories, They devoted an entire issue in the summer of 1969, because I can remember being at a girlfriend's house and seeing this magazine. The whole issue was devoted to the Americans who had died, like the previous week. It wasn't right up to that moment because it was a magazine. They had to get it published and all that. So they had like the high school or college pictures of these people. And, just all you saw on the cover, and then inside would be a picture, like a bust shot, and then the hometown, and then the age. And the whole magazine was, I think there was no advertising. I mean, it became a legendary issue, but it's coming into people's houses, maybe in Allendale and and everybody sort of sat back in shock, like, oh my God, these are real people who are dying. They look like my son, that kind of thing,
It took us about 7 interviews with different people to find one story that was on the positive side about the Vietnam War.
Their father was a Green Beret. You know about the Green Beret? They're the very elite military. And he went back to Vietnam like 4 or 5 times, and he got killed while the girls were like young teenagers. And the mother had an emotional breakdown, and there was a little boy at home too. The mother had a breakdown and just couldn't cope. And so the girls all came to an aunt and uncle in Allendale, and then came to Northern Highlands. And one of the sisters later wrote a book about her father. And he's buried. Not he's buried in Ramsey. He went to Ramsey High School, this man. But there's a monument in Ramsey to him, Charles Hosking. And there's a street named after him. But that's how in that case, it hit home, because these girls, they never really, I don't think they even announced it, because they were new to the school and they didn't want to make a big deal about it. But very interestingly, at some point during that year, they went to the White House and met President Nixon and the defense secretary, because their father was honored for a certain kind of heroism. I mean, I think he threw himself on a grenade to protect the people behind him. He died a real hero.
When we first started digging into the remembrance of Vietnam in this area, at first we found quite simply nothing. And we thought we were doing it wrong. However, after some time, we realized that we weren't the problem in the equation. It's impossible to find something that doesn't exist in the first place. And this is when we noticed that the lack of evidence actually contributes to the view on Vietnam in this school.
There are no memorials. The town journal and most publications barely mention it. And on top of it, when a historian wrote the history of Allendale from its inception to 1994, it discussed World War I and World War II, but not once did it talk about the entire Vietnam War. What we assumed from this lack of evidence is that there's a lack of evidence because they don't want to remember the Vietnam War. The community might not like the Vietnam War, and from what we've looked at, there are more examples for and supporting anti-war movements than anything else.
I mean, speaking from experience, whenever I don't want to remember something, I especially won't write it down. When something is just really disliked, it's not something you want to mention in your any kind of written document. It's a subject to be avoided, and that's exactly what this Vietnam War is. So as to how this compares to society as a whole, it seems pretty similar. Compared to World War II, the Vietnam War has been given a lot less memorials to remember it by. And like Highlands and this community, there are still many people who believe in the war and believe that it was a failure and unnecessary. According to our evidence, since we didn't find many signs that show a pro-war feeling in the Highlands community, the community might be a bit towards more of the anti-war side of the debate. Many people in America, such as veterans, politicians, and other groups, are and still do believe that the war was worth it and it should have been continued and made a success. This is the main difference we found between our community and the country as a whole, because we didn't find much of a presence of this pro-war feeling in the school or our 4 towns.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe to People Who Don't Matter.